Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the new episode of Culture and Conversation, where we discuss how culture is experienced in everyday life. My name is Chan-Hoong, I'm the host, and I'm privileged to have Professor Ying-Yi Hong, the Chong-Ming Professor of Psychology from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, to join us today. Ying-Yi, how are you?
Good. Good morning.
Morning, yes. I've looked at some of the research and they're all amazing. But I would like to begin by asking you about the dynamic constructivist theory of culture and cognition, which you've done lots of research in the last two decades. Now, in your research, you argue that individuals, especially those from Asian societies, they're able to switch between cultural frames of thinking depending on what is contextually salient. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And do people really think differently between the East and the West?
Great question. I started my research from Hong Kong in year 2000 because Hong Kong is a place where East meet West. And also importantly, I am a Hong Kong native. So when I grew up, I experienced both cultures. So growing up in a Chinese family, of course, I knew about Chinese culture. And then also in the formal education, we exposed to a lot of Western thoughts, ideas. We use English textbooks. So I think many young people or people who receive formal education in Hong Kong have both the Chinese cultural knowledge and also the Western cultural knowledge. And so that's the start. When I observe this, I wonder, how people would feel if they have both knowledge system in their mind. So I think my dynamic constructive theory is meant to apply to any bicultural individuals. So your question about whether it's just about Asian societies, I don't think so. I think it's applicable to anyone who have acquired two or more cultural knowledge system. And the phenomena that I try to explain is cultural frame switching, as what you just alluded to, which is the feeling that, or the experience that people would feel that they are applying different cultural knowledge when they are in different situations. And when I study that, actually, Torrey Higgins and Bob Wyer's theory of principles of knowledge activation seems very appropriate. Let me explain what principles of knowledge activations is. It consists of three basic principles. The principles of availability, that is, people need to have the knowledge. For example, here in the cultural frame switching, the person need to have acquired enough knowledge of two cultures. And then the second principle is the principle of accessibility. That is, in the immediate environment, there are cues that make one of the knowledge system more accessible in the person's mind. And then the third principle is the principle of applicability. When you have that accessible knowledge in mind, the immediate context allows you to apply that knowledge. So these three principles are the underlying mechanism of cultural frame switching. So as a result, I designed some experiments. In my experiments, I randomly assigned bicultural individuals into different cultural frame conditions. For example, for Chinese American biculturals, I randomly assigned them into the Chinese cultural knowledge condition, whereby I prime or I use Chinese images like the Great War to activate or to increase the accessibility of their Chinese knowledge at that moment. Or, the other group, I just, let them look at American cultural icons. For example, a picture of the Statues of Liberty. And by doing so, it will increase the accessibility of their American cultural knowledge. And also, I have the third group, which is a control. Usually is something unrelated to culture. For example, the shape of different clouds in the sky. Yeah. So these three groups, after they were primed or their knowledge system is activated, I measure the outcome variables. And so like what you said, over the past 20 years, we have measured different type of outcome variables. It could be attributions, internal versus external attributions, which have shown to be, to show a cross-cultural difference. So in our study, we also can prime, using priming, we replicate those cross-cultural differences. Behaviors, for example, people in a prisoner's dynamic game, whether they are cooperative or competitive, or even emotional projections. So we were able to see that actually by priming bicultural individuals, in a certain moments, they might apply either of their cultural knowledge. And of course, there are boundary conditions too. And then maybe I'll briefly talk about the boundary conditions that we have used. Yeah. For example, we have looked at the lay theories or lay beliefs of race, whether race is fixed or malleable. And in our study, we find that if the person believes that race is fixed, actually it's harder for them to navigate between cultural frames, even though they are bicultural individuals. And so I think this also reflects the cognitive representation. It seems like when they are fixed, they find it harder to see the two cultural system as compatible or switchable. So yeah, these are the basic findings we had shown in the past 20 years.
It's interesting, Ying-Yi, because I think you also reminded me that many of the Asian societies, Hong Kong being one, Singapore being another one, and also a lot of the other Southeast Asian countries, we are kind of bicultural in the sense that we also teach a second language in school, right? And the same for Hong Kong and for Singapore and other Asian countries. And I wonder if, has it made Asians more culturally fluid and adaptable compared to the people from the West? Because you look at some of the situations in whether in North America or in Europe, they may not have as much exposure to a different language or a different set of cultural systems. I don't know whether, based on your research, would that be one of the conclusions, and also would that be one of the implications that perhaps that understanding of culture and culture switching can be fine-tuned, right, in some of the Western European countries? What are your thoughts on that?
Great question again. Yeah, very observant. Yeah, and I think like what you said, in many Asian countries, people are bilingual or multilinguals. And I think, the cultural frame switching or my dynamic constructivist theory actually is very consistent with many theories in bilingualism. And then in bilingualism, actually, people who have acquired multiple cultures, they might have multiple views or outlook, yeah, through different languages. Yeah. So I think most linguists or people who study bicultural bilingualism would agree with that. If you have more language in your mind, it's easier for you to think about things from different angles or through the lens of the language that you are speaking. And so like what you said, in Asian countries, because of many, historical reasons, for example, Hong Kong was a British colony before. So in many of the formal education, we have English, yeah, as the medium of instructions. And I think that might hold true for some of the other Asian countries as well. And then in the Western countries, yeah, and I don't have statistics, but whether a person is bilingual or not might have a different probability. And I think in Europe, people are very bilingual or multilingual too. So I bet for them, it's the same. They can switch between cultural frames as a function of their language abilities. But one thing I just learned from my friends who study bilingualism is that there is a debate in linguistics whether being a bilingual or learning multiple languages would increase the executive functioning of individuals. Yeah. And indeed, actually, there were evidence, there were debate, but then there were some recent evidence showing that if someone who can showcase a fluid or flexible cultural frame switching, that means they can flexibly practice, different languages in different situations. Yeah, they can go in and out, of different situations and using the appropriate languages. They're shown to have higher executive functioning. So that's, in that case, the answer to your question is affirmative. But I think, again, there are individual differences, there are boundary conditions. And I think back to the boundary conditions that I have studied, late beliefs about race, we did find that people who believed race is fixed. That means they believe that race is biologically determining a person's trait and ability. They have a harder time switching between cultural frames. We measure their skin conductance. Indeed, we find a higher skin conductance as a function of their belief in fixed race. And it shows that they need more efforts in switching. Yeah. So I think that might be an evidence of their boundary conditions. So having multiple languages helps, but also have the more malleable mindset would help as well. Yeah.
Certainly. We live in a very globalized world today, and we see many Chinese consumer products established in Europe and America, and vice versa, Western products in the East. And we also see a lot of multinational companies establishing regional offices in different locations, East and West. And the workforce are a lot more diverse now than it was a decade ago. So given the depth of that cross-cultural immersion and globalization, do you think it's still meaningful to talk about, heritage maintenance in this interconnected world? Talk about culture, we're holding on to different systems of thinking, but, with that globalization, the depth of globalization, is it still meaningful in talking about heritage, Ying-Yi?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's related to my latest work on cultural attachment. So about 10 years ago, I started to develop a new theory called cultural attachment theory. I borrow from John Bowlby, Mary Ainsworth, infant attachment model, infant attachment theory. So the idea is that one can attach to one's own native culture, and see it as a safe haven. And so if people are reminded of their home cultural heritage, they would feel comfort or they would feel secured, especially when they're facing threatening situation or under stress. So I've studied, I've conducted a series of studies in Singapore. Actually, most of these studies were conducted in Singapore. For example, in one of the studies, we asked the Singaporean students to sit in front of a computer. And so it's a computer task. While they are looking at the computer screen, we also measure the skin conductance. So in each trial, we show them a threatening picture. And it's subliminally shown, meaning actually it's shown very quickly. They couldn't aware of it, but nonetheless, the brain will register the threat. And then immediately afterwards, we show either a cultural icon, like for example, the male lion picture, or just a control, a cartoon of something else. And then we measure the skin conductance change as a result of seeing the male lion image or the control image. Guess what? We find that, in fact, under threatening conditions, if the participants saw a male lion or Singapore Airline logo, they didn't have to shoot up skin conductors like when they were seeing a control, because the control cannot provide safe haven for them. And instead, their own cultural heritage icons provide safe haven. So that's one of the study, and we have used different paradigm to study this. And consistently, we find that one's native culture can serve as a safe haven for individuals when they're under threat. So I think that I think some of the people who study abroad or who are Sojournese might have similar experience when you are under threat. For example, you are studying for a very important final exam. You would crave for your hometown food, or the food that you eat, your mother prepared for you when you grow up.
Right.
So yeah. And I myself, when I was studying in the United States, when I'm under stress, I would look for Hong Kong movie to watch. It's very safe haven for me. Yeah.
Okay, so these are very safe bets.
Yeah.
It's interesting because, on the one hand, I hear contradictory feedback. So on the one hand, having some form of cultural affirmation can make you feel more secure, more confident. But on the other hand, we also hear that at times it can become more defensive and exclusionary, as you hold on to it. So my question is, how do we strike this fine balance between heritage maintenance and also being inclusive? Even as we engage somebody from a different background, where's the sweet spot, if there's one?
Yes. Yeah. Again, I will cite my own research. Let me tell you, an
Mm,
empirical, studies. I study cultural mixing. Yeah. So
mm,
what it meant is that I merged images from one culture with another culture. For
mm.
example, thinking like, if I put Guanyin, yeah, Guanyin is a Chinese cultural image.
God mercy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, the goddess of mercy, is head on the statues of liberty's head. So just to replace that. So that
Mm,
one is a kind of like fused images.
mm,
So the head belonged to a Chinese cultural symbol, and then the body belonged to an American cultural
mm.
symbol. And so this is one example. I put Chairman Mao's head on Lincoln's memorial. Yeah. So Lincoln's head.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and so forth. Yeah. So after I mix these cultural images, I looked at a group of white Americans, and I asked them, to what extent you feel disgust about this picture. Yeah. And I compare their disgust response towards the fused images with single presentation,
Mm,
just Chairman Mao's statues, and then
mm,
the Lincoln's memorial statues, and also side by side only.
mm,
Yeah. And indeed, the fused culture elicit higher disgust. So I think this is interesting when you merge two culturally iconic images together. Most people will feel disgust. So I think that is one sense of interconnection. Of course, not all cultural communication or cultural interaction will be like that. So I think that this is one point. Yeah, when you merge like that, and especially culturally like symbolic images. But also another very interesting thing is that I also find individual differences. And the individual differences is very consistent with what I just told you about the lay beliefs about race, and also need for cognitive quotient, meaning, whether you want to avoid ambiguity and you want a more closed mind mentality. And that would also increase the disgust response.
mm.
Now, some other people told me that if your fused images are not that symbolic of the culture, it's just two things from two culture, some people might feel entertained by it. That's possible too. So I'm
Mm.
not saying that negative disgust response is necessary. I think there could be, more positive responses, but I think it depends on how, the two cultural images emerged. Yeah, and also who are looking at these merged images. Yeah, so again, to your question, I think it depends. Yeah, all these depends
There are many
whether,
different variables.
right, yeah, the
Yeah,
situation, how the merge is going, and also who are looking at this. Yeah.
certainly. Ying-Yi, we spend more than half of our waking
Mm,
hours in the workplace.
mhm,
And work is a very central part of who we
mm,
are. And we interact with people from a very different background regularly in the workplace, in our jobs. So, and given the diversity of workforce, should we start thinking about a cultureless communication? Because after all, there's so much, cultural baggage and misunderstanding. Would a cultural neutral place be something that we should explore and consider moving forward?
Great question again. I think to answer your question first, I need to clarify the relationship or the mental representation of three terms: culture, race, and ethnicity. And actually, we indeed asked American college students about these three terms. Guess what? What we find is that they cannot articulate the distinction. So therefore, based on this, in answering your question, I would turn like cultureless communication to like might be colorless communication, like meaning, not thinking about racial, ethnic, cultural background of the individuals. Okay. If that is the case, you allow me to do that, then I think there is a whole host of literature on different type of ideologies. For example, the one cultureless or colorless is related to
Yeah,
colorblind
that's right.
ideology. Yeah. So I think in the literature, some researchers have already found that when you are using a colorblind ideology, sometimes people would feel that their own cultural heritage is being denied or ignored. Yeah. And this is especially true for minority or stigmatized, marginalized group, because these groups, the racial, ethnic, cultural stereotypes are deeply rooted in the society already. And also there are institutionalized inequality, yeah, of them. And then if we deny a person's race, not talking about say, oh, now let's do cultureless, colorblind, then these group of people will feel that you are denying the deeply rooted injustice. So I think it could backfire. So I think rather, in that literature, they talk more about polyculturalism nowadays. So polycultural ideology acknowledge the cultural differences instead of saying, yeah, let's ignore it. Yeah, they acknowledge the cultural differences, and they will try to learn and work with other cultures to understand what their backgrounds are, what are their assumptions, and then work together to find a common ground and mutually respected space. So maybe that would be one message for the workplace.
Right, a better compromise, I suppose.
Right.
Yes.
And learning
Well,
as well, mutual learning.
yes, that's right. You know, there used to be many negative stereotypes against products made in China. And in the past, many Chinese-made consumer goods were considered inferior and unreliable. But today, if you look at the Made in China label, a lot of them are seen to be of high quality and of high tech. So you can think of BYD, EVs, and robotics as an example. But ironically, though, I mean, when we look at intercultural relations, particularly between US and China, we see a slightly different picture in that many Chinese scholars, established Chinese scholars, are leaving American universities for opportunities elsewhere, as they are regarded as less trustworthy or less desirable, according to US immigration. So in essence, while the Chinese products made in China products has a positive image, the view of the people as a community has turned negative. And my question is, is this negative stereotype of people an inevitable result of perceived competitions and threats from those countries? And I would imagine, maybe something similar would have happened in the 1980s during the Japanese ascent in the economic and technological powers. So what are your views on this?
Wow, your question is very timely and very vague. Yeah, and I think political scientists might have some answers for you. But actually, recently I got very interested in political psychology, so I also have done some study on that topic. And I think first, I think the U.S. society is not a monolithic entity. Yeah, that means it's very heterogeneous. Yeah, there are heterogeneous views within the United States, and so in my own study as well. And then, so for example, in terms of political opinions, including, for example, attitudes towards immigration, just, for example, towards any immigrants, not only Chinese people, it's quite divided in the US society nowadays. So I think first, there might be different views. Some might be positive, some might be negative. Yeah, so that's the first point. Second, I don't deny that there are negative views. Yeah, like, a portion of American people who are, turn out to be very vocal. They share, explicit negative attitudes towards Chinese people or Chinese community in the United States. And one example is the attack towards Chinese people and also other Asians during COVID-19 pandemic. Yeah, and I think that's a case in point. And then we have just published a paper showing that there is evidence of implicit association between disease and Chinese people during and even after the pandemic now. And then, we said in our study, we suggest that might be because the leader, President Trump, called the COVID-19 virus the China virus. So this association has increased the likelihood of implicit associations of disease with Chinese people. And I think as a social psychologist, we need to point this out and make sure that people are aware of their implicit biases. So I think that's what, I'm trying to do in my research now. But of course, there are bigger, more global political, backdrop that political scientists might look at more. Yeah.
Thank you. Ying-Yi, this is so insightful. We cover so much, in less than 30 minutes. Thank you so much for all the sharing. This is a wonderful, to have you here on this episode. And we hope to see you again in our future episodes of Culture in Conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.